It's the early 1930s in Mandatory Palestine, and the violence that punctuated the previous decade has turned the region upside down. Since the British took control of the area in 1917, nothing like this had happened previously. The scale of the violence, the death toll, the weaponization of holy sites as a pretext for massacring civilians, it was all unprecedented. We walked through step by step how the region got here, and while hindsight is always 20/20, when you look at the players, the power dynamics, the motivations behind their actions, it's not hard to see how we arrived at this moment. As the 1930s unfold, the positions of the Jews and Arabs in Palestine begin to harden, and by the end of the decade, it will be clear that a major confrontation is no longer avoidable. And so with all of that in mind, let's turn to our critique of Episode 5 of Fear and Loathing in the New Jerusalem, a miniseries by Darryl Cooper for the Martyr Made podcast that traces the history of the Israeli-Palestinian conflict. Cooper opens the episode with a line that I think, given everything that we've covered so far, is worth highlighting. He says, quote, "One thing you may have picked up on through the first few episodes is that I'm not real big on blame," end quote. He continues, quote, "But I got this problem where every time I want to get myself worked up to blame or hate somebody, the closer I look at their situation, the harder it gets for me to hang on to that hatred," end quote. Blame. Blame is a hell of a thing. Everyone has bias. We're human, after all. There's always an impulse to pick a side. There's a reason they say history is written by the victors, although lately it feels like it's being written by influencers more than anyone else. Let's dive into things and fix that. Cooper picks things up where we left off, in the aftermath of the violence in 1929 and the start of the early 1930s. He says, quote, "If I find myself unable to understand even vaguely how somebody or some group could behave in a given manner, then that just means that I haven't done enough work. Okay, we're talking about human beings here, not monsters, not aliens, and so if I write off someone else's actions as simply evil or incomprehensible, that's a failure of both imagination and empathy on my part. It means I'm not doing my job." And we ended the last episode with the riots that erupted across Palestine in August 1929 when Arab peasants poured into the cities after the cry went out that the Zionists were trying to seize the hill in Jerusalem that still is, sacred to both Muslims and Jews, and these riots were a real tipping point in relations between the two groups, end quote. This is close to the start of the installment, and there are already several issues to break down. First, as we covered last episode, the Jews weren't trying to seize a hill in Jerusalem. That claim was manufactured by Husseini, the Grand Mufti of Jerusalem, who incited the riots by falsely accusing the Jews of threatening Islamic holy sites. This wasn't true, as we covered previously. It was a deliberate lie, a weaponization of religious sentiment used to incite violence against Jews in 1929. That lie triggered massacres in Jerusalem and throughout Palestine, after years of tension surrounding the Western Wall being ignored or undermined and British authorities refusing to intervene or uphold Jewish religious rights. The second issue with this quote lies in Cooper's incredulity surrounding the idea of evil intent. His implication is that if we don't understand why someone behaves a certain way, if we chalk it up to malevolence or bad faith, that's a failure on our part, not theirs. What he's really saying here, to be clear, is that nefarious intentions can never be the root cause of someone's actions, and that suggesting otherwise simply reflects a lack of imagination or empathy. But we've discussed this already. Husseini clearly intended for the violence of 1929 to unfold. That was the objective. When questioned by the British afterward, he invoked the Protocols of the Elders of Zion, a fabricated anti-Jewish text created by the Russian monarchy in the early 20th century as a scapegoat for the empire's domestic issues. And this was hardly a one-off. In 1941, Husseini met with Adolf Hitler in Berlin and later went on to recruit Muslim troops for the SS in Bosnia. You'd be hard-pressed to find a more deliberately destructive person in the history of this conflict. Now look, Every historical figure, whether we see them as a hero or a villain, operates with internal motivations they believe to be righteous. But Cooper's argument here goes further. He implies that no one's actions can be described as evil, that moral judgment is always a failure of understanding. But Husseini's repeated behavior was plainly nefarious. He lied to spark violence, and the result was mass murder. Cooper's claim that evil intent is never real, just misunderstood, glosses over the facts. This wasn't a war between combatants. It was targeted violence against civilians, predicated on a lie. Cooper, for some reason, then goes off on a deep dive on the history of the Jews in Europe. Again, there's a lot to unpack here, so we're going to break this down. He tells us that in the context of Europe, quote, if every group has a specific niche to fill, then the Jews could just be another group with another role specific to what they could offer and what the settled population needed from them. The fact that they were apart, it wasn't as much of a factor because everybody was kind of in their own little situation. For most of the last 1,000 years of European history, Jewish communities were basically left to run their own affairs. They would face violence sometimes, and in crisis moments things would happen, but on a day-to-day basis, they were left to themselves. For the most part, they existed as separate corporate communities with their own legal codes, with the right to administer social events like weddings and births and funerals according to their own customs, and to arbitrate their own disputes. End quote. This feels like a total 180 compared to episode 1, where Cooper starts us off with a graphic visualization of what Jewish pogroms in Europe actually looked like. The Jewish experience in medieval Europe, outside of a relative window of safety in Poland, wasn't sunshine and rainbows. As we covered in the first episode, it was a history marked by subjugation and discrimination. Jews were expelled from England in 1290 and Spain in 1492, and when Russia took over the lands of the Polish-Lithuanian Commonwealth, Jews were sequestered to the Pale of Settlement and were restricted from professions and from attending academic institutions. Jewish children were forcibly conscripted into the Russian army to remove them of their connections to their Jewish communities. This wasn't a one-off experience. This was a staple of Jewish life in the European context since the exile from Judea. In previous episodes, Cooper acknowledges this, so it's really unclear why here in episode 5 he does an about-face and seems to contradict himself. He doubles down when he says, quote, "This is happening at a time in Europe when pagans and even heterodox Christians are being exterminated, and so the Jews, are being permitted to live according to their own religious traditions. It was a bit exceptional at the time, and so the sanctuaries start to creep on a little bit, and the absolutist state in Western Europe gives birth to the early nation-state and Jewish communities and their newly nationalist neighbors. Now they're facing some very difficult questions about where the Jews are going to fit into this new type of society." End quote. Cooper goes on, quote, "As the Jews in the West begin the process of what would come to be called Jewish emancipation, the Ostjuden, the Eastern Jews, could only stand by and hear about it from afar. By the time we get up to the period of Zionism's emergence, early Zionism is driven by Eastern European and Russian Jews who are fleeing a much more traditional Jewish life, one in which Jews had hardly even begun the process of assimilation." End quote. And lastly, he says, quote, "So while the Western Jews had begun to feel a little more comfortable in their skin when moving among their Gentile neighbors, the Russian Jews still interacted with their neighbors with the same distrust and hostility that had colored the relationship of each to the other for centuries. When you live in the diaspora for 2,500 years and you actually manage to survive that way, both physically and culturally, that does not happen by accident." End quote. These statements contradict much of what Cooper himself previously laid out. Remember, he spent significant time walking through Theodor Herzl's arguments in Der Judenstaat, the Jewish state, where Herzl lays out the foundation of modern political Zionism, that Jewish safety and self-determination can only be secured through the creation of a sovereign Jewish country. Cooper spent a lot of time quoting Herzl directly in episode 1, and it's important to recall Herzl wasn't a Russian Jew. He wasn't orthodox. He wasn't isolated or traditional. He was born in Budapest in 1860, educated in Vienna, worked as a newspaper correspondent in Paris, and spoke fluent German and Hungarian. He was as assimilated and cosmopolitan as a Jew in Western Europe could be. Like many Jews of his time, he actively sought integration into European society and embraced its culture. And yet, even Herzl came to the conclusion that assimilation would never be enough, that the persistence of Jew hatred, even in so-called enlightened societies like France, made a Jewish homeland not just desirable but necessary. As we covered earlier, it was the Dreyfus Affair, the false conviction of a Jewish army officer in France for sharing state secrets with the Germans, that catalyzed Herzl's transformation from a liberal journalist to the founder of a national movement. When overwhelming evidence surfaced that Dreyfus was innocent, the military and government suppressed it. And when the truth did come out, it took years for the injustice to be corrected. In the meantime, anti-Jewish riots broke out across France. A sobering revelation about how Jews were really seen even in one of Europe's most liberal republics. He was eventually acquitted after more than a decade, but the spectacle peeled back a curtain on how the French felt toward their Jewish citizens, and anti-Jewish riots that erupted within the country only drove the point home further. Herzl wasn't the only Western Jew at the heart of early Zionism. Chaim Weizmann, who we've discussed at length, was living in Manchester, England. He became president of the World Zionist Organization, and would later become the first president of Israel. He was instrumental in securing the Balfour Declaration, the British government's formal endorsement of a Jewish national home in Palestine. The reason that all of this matters is because Cooper is trying to argue that assimilated Jews in Western Europe didn't feel the need for Zionism, that only the unassimilated Jews of Eastern Europe pushed for it. But the historical record tells a different story. The two most influential early Zionist leaders, Herzl and Weizmann, were thoroughly assimilated Western Jews who nonetheless saw Zionism as urgent and necessary. They weren't retreating from modernity, they were reacting to the limits of acceptance within it. And it wasn't just Jews from Europe. Early Zionist support came from Jews in the Middle East as well. Ezra Dangur, the chief rabbi of Baghdad, was once asked by King Faisal of Iraq whether he was a Zionist. Dangur's reply? "We are all Zionists, since we pray 3 times a day for the return to Zion." So, the narrative Cooper offers, that Zionism was only a product of Eastern European Jewish alienation, simply doesn't hold up. The push for Jewish self-determination came from all directions, East and West, religious and secular, Ashkenazi and Mizrahi. The common thread wasn't isolation, it was the realization across the Jewish world that no matter how much Jews integrated, they remained vulnerable. That realization, more than anything else, is what gave birth to Zionism. Cooper then continues this historical revisionism of the Jewish experience in Europe with a focus on Russia. He says, quote, "Now the Jews were still restricted within the Russian Empire as far as where they could live, and the activities they were permitted to engage in, but the restrictions were not a whole lot more onerous than those faced by other minorities in the empire, except insofar as Jewish quotas in universities and occupations were always full because they were so successful at anything they did. They were geographically restricted, but restricted to a mass area stretching from the Black Sea in the south to the Baltic Sea in the north, and encompassing some or all of the modern countries of Latvia, Lithuania, Poland, Ukraine, Belarusia, a big area called the Jewish Pale of Settlement." End quote. Cooper goes on to talk about the Jewish pogroms that followed the assassination of Tsar Alexander II in 1881, when Jews were scapegoated and blamed for the Tsar's death. Quote, "This outbreak of violence hit the Jewish community like a ton of bricks, especially the young Jews who had been pouring so much of themselves into becoming part of the Russian culture for the entire 19th century. Jews had been energetically doing everything they could to become a part of Russian society. They were learning the language, they were becoming writers and poets in their own right, they were building up the Russian economy. Everything they could do, only to find out, to their shock and horror, that they hadn't even begun to be accepted at all. That the progress they thought they had been making all this time was just an illusion. And this had an incredibly traumatic effect on the Jewish population of the Russian Empire. an effect honestly far out of proportion to the actual scale of the violence. I mean, the worst of the pogroms were usually a few dozen killed and wounded in the Kishinev pogrom, which is one of the most infamous. We spoke of that one in the first episode, killed 118 people. That's horrible, but we compare this to what, with hindsight, we know was coming down the tracks of the 20th century. Whether we're talking about the 7,000 killed by the Bosnian Serbs in 1995 in Srebrenica, or the 850,000 to a million killed in Rwanda a year before that, or the millions and millions killed in the Revolutionary Terror in the decades before that. All the pogroms together would barely register in comparison, and yet this did have an incredibly traumatic effect. End quote. This is an astonishing downplay of what life was actually like in the Pale of Settlement for Jews living under the authority of the Russian crown, contradicted by any serious historical review of the time. Once again, Cooper is backtracking on earlier acknowledgments of the brutality of Jewish life in the Pale with a 1-2 punch. On the one hand, suggesting that life there wasn't so bad, and on the other, minimizing the pogroms by reducing them to casualty figures compared with later genocides. He says outright that the Jewish reaction to the pogroms was out of proportion to the violence they endured. I've said this before, but it's worth repeating. After living for centuries at the whims of princes and peasants in the diaspora after the Roman exile, a breaking point had been reached. This was the straw that broke the camel's back. Historian Benny Morris expands on what life was like in the Pale and directly contradicts Cooper when he says, quote, "The reality of Jewish life, when most of the world's Jews lived in the European part of the Russian Empire known as the Pale of Settlement, running from Memel in the north to Crimea on the Black Sea, was one of continuous discrimination and insecurity and occasional oppression and violence." The historian Eli Kaduri once spoke of the deep insult of diaspora life. Basic freedoms of movement, place of residence, language, occupation, and worship were severely curtailed or regulated by the state. The restrictions, including prohibition of land ownership, assured the impoverishment and socioeconomic immobility of most Jews in the Pale. During the mid-19th century, Jews were subjected to a brutal system of 25-year military conscription, which occasionally entailed the virtual kidnapping of their children at the age of 12 or even sometimes at 8 or 9, and their attempted conversion to Christianity by the authorities in special preparatory military schools. Indeed, an official Russian government commission in 1888 defined the Jews' condition as one of repression and disenfranchisement, discrimination and persecution. End quote. I'm going to be honest with you. I couldn't help but laugh a little bit after comparing Cooper's depiction of Jewish life in the Pale of Settlement with how the Russian government itself, arguably the most anti-Jewish regime in 19th century Europe, described its own treatment of the Jews, one of repression, disenfranchisement, discrimination, and persecution. That self-critique, coming from the very government that sequestered the Jews and later authored the Protocols of the Elders of Zion, is more damning than Cooper's own revisionist narrative on how the Russians treated the Jews themselves. It's really quite shocking. In the aftermath of the 1929 riots, the British realized that things were spiraling out of control and that action was necessary. In response, they chose to placate the local Arab population by issuing the Passfield White Paper in 1930, which restricted Jewish immigration and remained in effect until 1931. It's within this context that Cooper makes another one of those pinprick remarks I commented on last episode. He's talking about how the pogroms in Russia warped the Jewish psyche, and how the 1929 riots had a similar effect in Palestine. He says, quote, "Just as in 1881, when their grand hopes were dashed by Indigenous violence, the Zionists again had some decisions to make about their future." End quote. The words that stood out to me here were Indigenous violence. The implication is that the Jews were subjected to violence in Russia by people who were indigenous, that is, native Russians who weren't Jews. What Cooper is suggesting implicitly is that Jews were an outgroup and therefore not truly Russian. The framing evokes something biological, a host body attacking a virus with white blood cells, and this isn't the first time he's made an offhanded comment that carries this implication. I think the main thrust of this, the real question that needs to be put to Cooper is, where do the Jews belong? Where should Jews live? His framing is clear. Jews weren't indigenous to the Pale of Settlement, evident he implies by the indigenous violence Jews face there. And I think it's fair to say, based on the narrative he's crafted in this miniseries and comments he's made elsewhere, that he doesn't think Jews belong in Mandatory Palestine or modern Israel either. So the question bears repeating. Where does he think the Jews belong? And honestly, I can't answer that question. Cooper then goes on to claim that the best place to be a Jew prior to World War I was in the Ottoman Empire. Quote, on the whole though, the Ottoman Empire in general and Palestine in particular was the easiest place on the planet to be a Jew. End quote. To bolster this point, he cites a few examples, letters from individuals who spent time in the Ottoman Levant, pointing out that the Jews and Arabs in the region reportedly got along without intercommunal issues. Benny Morris offers a more sobering take on the treatment of Jews in the Ottoman Empire. He writes, quote, Arabs in Palestine in the 19th and early 20th centuries often referred to Jews as the children of death. End quote. He continues, quote, Jewish poverty in most of the Ottoman lands in the 19th and 20th centuries appears to have been, in some measure at least, the result of discriminatory practices. End quote. Legally, Jews were treated as dhimmi, a protected but subordinate class until 1856, when the Ottoman Empire issued an edict granting formal equality to all subjects. But in practice, this second-class status persisted well into the collapse of the empire after World War I. As we've already covered, discrimination against Jews was a recurring feature of life in both the Middle East and Europe. Yes, there were pockets of relative calm, like the Polish-Lithuanian Commonwealth, but Cooper's suggestion that the Holy Land under the Ottomans was uniquely hospitable raises more questions than it answers. By what metric is he measuring this? Because if poverty, legal inferiority, and regular social prejudice are the benchmarks, it's hard to see how that constitutes the best place on earth to be a Jewish person. Cooper then takes it a step further. He claims that Palestinian Arabs in the Ottoman Empire had it just as bad as the Jews in the lands of the Romanovs. He says, quote, the standards of living and the rights of the typical Palestinian peasant in the 19th century were at least as difficult as those faced by the Jews of the Russian Empire during the same period. End quote. He continues, quote, the vast majority of Palestinian Arabs had lives that were just as difficult and oppressive as anything the Jews faced in the Russian Empire. End quote. So now Cooper's not just downplaying the experience of Jewish persecution in Eastern Europe, he's entering into some kind of strange oppression Olympics, drawing a false equivalence between Palestinian peasants and Jews confined to the Pale of Settlement, who were subjected to pogroms, quotas, and state-sanctioned discrimination. Now look, it's pretty clear, just from the empire's name, that Ottoman Turks were in the driver's seat, but the suggestion that Palestinian Arabs were treated just as badly as Jews under the Romanovs, that doesn't hold water. Most Palestinian Arabs were Muslims. They shared a religious identity with the ruling elite. Many prominent Arab families in Palestine sent their sons to Ottoman universities, military academies, and civil institutions. There were no ethnic quotas, no laws barring Arabs from public office, no mob violence targeting them for being Arab. Trying to equate that experience with what Jews endured in Eastern Europe is not just historically incoherent, it's a distortion of both histories. And here's the deeper question. Why is Cooper making this comparison at all? Why frame this as some kind of twisted oppression Olympics? Is it to minimize the suffering of one group? To cast doubt on the legitimacy of another's historical trauma? I'll let you come to your own conclusions. The equivocation doesn't stop there. Cooper continues, quote, there's something like a dark mirror in that children revolt against their parents. That rift that had emerged earlier between the younger and older Russian Jews after 1881, with the former, the younger, becoming so disillusioned with the impotence of the older generation that they finally took matters into their own hands. End quote. He's making this point in the context of young Jews turning to Zionism after the European pogroms, and he draws an analogy to young Palestinian Arabs rejecting what he sees as the meekness of their parents and rising up against Jewish immigration to Palestine. It's an attempt to equate the two experiences, and in doing so, to lend them both legitimacy. But there's an enormous difference here, in both form and substance. The Jews in Europe were persecuted for who they were. They were beaten, murdered, and driven out because of their ethnicity and religion. They fled not to conquer, but to survive. They purchased land legally and tried to build a better future for themselves in a land in which they had a deep historical and spiritual connection. As a result of this immigration, Cooper tells us that the outpouring of violence was a natural consequence, that the Arabs felt that their country was being taken away from them, and that the tolerance of the Arabs had reached a boiling point. So, of course, this violence was a natural and expected outcome of all of this. I don't think so. I don't buy it. We've covered previously how many Palestinian notables themselves sold land to the Jews, and that there was much more supply of land for sale at the time than there was demand due to financial constraints on the part of the Jews immigrating to the region and the organizations like the Jewish National Fund supporting them. Let's also remember that the first serious outbreaks of violence in Mandatory Palestine, the riots of 1920, 1921, and later in 1929, weren't initiated by Jews. In every case, it was the Jewish community that was attacked. It's not hard to imagine a different timeline, one where Jewish immigration continued and there was no violence in 1920, 1921, or 1929. One where figures like Jabotinsky, who only turned to the idea of the Iron Wall after Jews were killed in the streets, might never have gained traction. One where the later British partition plans, which we'll talk about soon, had a chance of being accepted by both sides. The thing about violence is that it has a way of hardening psychology. Consider the breakup of Yugoslavia in the 1990s. You had Croats, Bosnians, Serbs, and others, multiple ethnic and religious groups, who had lived together in a unified state. The Serbs didn't want that state to break apart. They tried to hold on to it, but once the shootings started, it was impossible to imagine living together again. The spell was broken. The trust was shattered. Once you cross that Rubicon, once there's blood in the streets, you can't go back. Cycles of vengeance begin, and to think that the Mandate-era violence in Palestine was somehow different is wishful thinking. Look, this is one of those instances where multiple things can be true at the same time, and these things can and do conflict with each other. Jews had faced discrimination since time immemorial, and rightfully felt like there was a need to pursue self-determination somewhere. And the most appropriate place for that somewhere is obviously the place where there's the most religious, cultural, and genetic connection to. A place where there was no country previously and frankly no sovereignty being breached. The Jews had every reason to feel unsafe in the world, and the local Arabs, they felt the character of their homeland was changing, and they were entitled to feel uneasy about that. And I can't believe I'm saying this, on this one narrow point, Cooper and I might agree. The local Arabs had limited options. They could emigrate to nearby Arab-majority states if they wanted to live in an Arab-only society, something many had hoped for back when Faisal's short-lived kingdom existed in Syria and there were calls for Palestine to be annexed by that same kingdom. Or they could stay and live under the British Mandate, which had replaced Ottoman control after World War I. But whatever their choices were, I don't believe the Arabs of Palestine had to lose as badly as they did. Cooper talks as if the violence was inevitable, as if Husseini had to stoke the flames, as if the massacre in Hebron had to happen, as if the lie that Jews were endangering Muslim holy sites had to be spread. I don't believe that. I believe there's a version of this story where Jews immigrated peacefully, where Arabs responded peacefully, and where the land was ultimately shared and perhaps partitioned. That's not the timeline we live in, but that timeline exists, and it could have been ours. Cooper goes on to make an interesting claim that hostility toward Jews in the Muslim world began to take on a uniquely European character only after East met West in the aftermath of World War I. He states in reference to the Muslim world, quote, "They had always seen the Zionists, I mentioned a little while ago, they had always seen the Zionists as a Trojan horse for European imperialism, but after a dozen years of listening to bitter British officers complain that there was nothing they could do, that, I agree with you guys, but hey, I can't do anything, the Jews are too powerful and they control the actions of our government back home." The Arabs began to buy into that. They began to learn the language of European anti-Semitism. And there's anti-Jewish bigotry, right? You just don't like some groups of people, but anti-Semitism has a specific connotation for most people, right? When most people hear it, they don't just think of people who don't like Jews. They associate it with a particular kind of dislike, the conspiracy theories about Jews running the world and controlling the banks and governments and bending the planet to their diabolic will. That was something that had never existed in the Arab world. They didn't have any experience with Jews other than the traditional Middle Eastern Jews that they were used to and got along with for the most part. It wasn't until the Europeans showed up with Mark Sykes, if you remember from the first episode, telling Emir Faisal that the Jews controlled all the world's financial centers and governments and so forth. And so many important leaders, Winston Churchill, so many others, were writing and talking about all this, that the Arabs began to pick it up, and if it seemed improbable to them at first, their experiences seemed to confirm it. How else were they supposed to explain the fact that so many of the military, police, and mandate authorities working for the British government that they came into contact with and who seemed to support their cause, that they were saying that they had to take their orders from a British government that was always seeming to come down on the side of the Zionists, end quote. There's a lot to unpack here. As with much of Cooper's framing, there's a kernel of truth, but it's buried under layers of distortion. In earlier episodes, we already addressed the deep history of anti-Semitism in the Islamic world. We discussed the Epistle to Yemen in 1172 from Maimonides, where he speaks directly to the persecution of Jews in Muslim lands and the widespread pattern of forced conversions and second-class dhimmi status Jews experienced for centuries. So, to suggest that anti-Semitism in the Middle East emerged solely, or even primarily because of post-World War I British rhetoric is a gross misrepresentation of the historical record. Let's be clear, Amin al-Husseini, who we've already discussed, met with Adolf Hitler directly and actively worked to prevent Jewish refugees from reaching Palestine in 1943, ensuring they would be sent to their deaths instead. Anti-Semitism in Palestine and the broader Arab world was unquestionably intensified by Nazi ideology, and al-Husseini played a central role in spreading those views to his followers. This, not the offhanded remarks of British officers, is the primary conduit through which modern European-style anti-Semitism entered Arab political discourse. There's a reason that a burger joint called Adolf Burger exists in Baghdad. It actually exists. Look it up. The fact that a Nazi-themed restaurant can operate openly in a major Arab capital tells you a lot about how Nazi ideology was received in parts of the Middle East. This admiration didn't materialize in a vacuum. It has a lineage, one that runs straight through Berlin and Husseini. So, yes, Cooper is partly correct that European anti-Semitism influenced the Middle East, but the idea that British comments were the decisive factor, or that Arab views were wholly external imports, is not just incorrect, but it strips historical agency from Arab leaders and intellectuals who promoted anti-Semitic ideologies for their own reasons and on their own terms. Matthias Kunzel, in his 2023 book Nazis, Islamic Antisemitism in the Middle East, offers a much more accurate and grounded perspective. The book, quote, examines how the Nazis could anchor Islamist antisemitism in the Arab world, and how the image of the Jews in Islam changed under the influence of Nazi Germany's Arabic language propaganda. Islamism emerged as a distinctive interpretation of the religion of Islam, evident in key texts by Haj Amin al-Husseini, Hassan al-Banna, and Sayyid Qutb. The result was to justify a religious war which fostered a cult of martyrdom, fanaticism, and justification of terror aimed at Jews. Anti-Semitism in the Arab societies was not primarily a response to the establishment of the State of Israel. Rather, admiration for Hitler and Rommel and hatred of the Jews was strong before Israel was established. After 1945, the Arab area was the only region of the world in which a pro-National Socialist past was a source of pride, not shame. End quote. The book continues, quote, "The reason for that anomaly was not the establishment of Israel, but the influence of the Nazis on events in the Middle East between 1937 and 1948, and the impact of years of anti-Semitic Nazi propaganda in the Arabic language. Only when we understand how strongly modern Middle Eastern history was influenced by the after-effects of National Socialism will we be able to properly understand and adequately counter Jew hatred." Kunzel attributes real agency to Arab actors, especially Husseini. He identifies Husseini's 1937 tract, Islam and the Jews, as the founding document of Islamic antisemitism, one that forged a direct ideological link between the 7th century conflict between Muhammad and the Jews of Medina and the 20th century war in Palestine. End quote. In other words, Husseini reframed what had been, until then, a largely political dispute over land into a holy war of extermination. That shift, from political grievance to theological imperative, was not the work of British military officers. It was the project of Arab leaders, influenced by, but not puppeteered by, the Nazis. This is further bolstered by the following quote, and we're going back to Kunzel here. "Husseini contributed to transforming a limited and secular conflict over Palestinian territory into an unlimited religious war that was a matter of life and death, at whose core was an antagonism to the Jews which Husseini claimed was at the core of Islam." End quote. And lastly, we're told that, quote, "Islamic antisemitism was not the result of the Zionist goals before 1948 or of the actions of the State of Israel during the war of 1948 and after. Rather, it was the cause first of the rejection of the compromise partition plans and then of the war itself." End quote. I know I've repeated this a number of times at this point, but that original claim in episode 1, where Cooper characterized this conflict as a strictly political rather than religious war, just keeps aging more poorly as time goes on. It's interesting how Cooper cites a few instances of questionable British rhetoric about the Jews, but entirely omits the importance of the Nazis and their influence on the Middle East as a key driver in the region. So, as usual, there's a hint of truth behind Cooper's comments here. European Jew hatred did play a role in the evolution of the Israeli-Palestinian conflict, but it was Nazi propaganda, not British politicians, who played the starring role in this play. And to use the Nazis as an excuse to absolve political leaders of guilt in the Middle East when they maintained Jew hatred themselves independent to and prior to their interactions with the Nazis is disingenuous. As we covered previously, Husseini was fostering this with the masses before he was in Germany. The 1929 riots came about because of this animus to a large degree. All of this is to say three things. First, the Nazis bear primary responsibility for making European-style conspiracy theories about Jews mainstream in the Middle East. Second, Haj Amin al-Husseini was one of the chief propagators of these ideas, and in his role as a leader of the Palestinian national movement, actively promoted anti-Semitic hatred before and after absorbing these views. And third, the Nazis didn't invent this worldview for him. They simply accelerated and reinforced ideas that were already taking root. Another interesting claim Cooper makes has to do with Jewish demographics. He's referring to a series of letters exchanged between Chaim Arlosarov and Chaim Weizmann, discussing the state of affairs in Palestine following the 1929 riots. There's an understandable sense of anxiety about the Jewish future in the region, and much of the correspondence reflects on that uncertainty. Eventually, Arlosarov hones in on the demographic dilemma. Cooper refers to Arlosarov's letters directly, quote, "Moreover, it is scarcely necessary for me to remind you that the non-Jewish population of Palestine is increasing at a rapid rate. A decade ago, a Jewish majority or numerical equality in Palestine was a matter of 500,000 additional persons. Today, it's a question of 800,000. In another 15 years, it'll be a question of 1.25 million, but since the area of Palestine, even within its widest border, is fixed, the pressure on the means of subsistence in the country will rapidly increase." End quote. He goes on to say, quote, Arlosarov is telling Weitzman, who is not in Palestine, remember that we are running out of time. The Jews have lived in the diaspora for thousands of years, moving from place to place. When that's your life, it doesn't really make sense to have 12 kids per family, because a dozen kids are hard to herd together if you have to flee a pogrom or you're run out of town by the local peasants. And so as a result, to this day, Jews tend to opt for a low output, high investment, reproductive strategy, right? Don't have a lot of kids, put a huge amount of energy into the ones that you do have. End quote. This is a strange claim, because even on something as seemingly straightforward as demographics, Cooper still manages to distort the reality. Israel today has the highest fertility rate among all OECD countries, a group that includes not just the US, Canada, and the countries of Western Europe, but also nations like Turkey, Mexico, Colombia, Chile, and Australia. As of 2025, Israel ranks 61st globally by birth rate with an average of 2.75 to 3 births per woman. Of the 60 countries with higher fertility rates, 39 of them, or 65%, are in Africa, and 5 of them, or 8%, are in the Middle East. That means Israel's birth rate far surpasses the entirety of Europe and North America, as well as most of Asia and Latin America. The data doesn't lie, and it flatly contradicts Cooper's implication that Jews produce fewer children due to diasporic flight mentality. In fact, Israel is a global outlier in the opposite direction. Even historically, in the Pale of Settlement in Russia, Jews maintained a high fertility rate, according to Jana Wobeka, a researcher in social demography at the Wittgenstein Center for Demography in Vienna, in a 2013 paper titled Forerunners of the Fertility Transition, Jews in Bohemia from the Enlightenment until the Interwar Times. She says, quote, Jewish communities in Eastern Europe, in particular in the Pale of Settlement, which in the late 19th century still maintained these traditional values and had high fertility. End quote. So, Cooper isn't just incorrect in his modern framing of this statement, he's also incorrect historically. It's just a bizarre thing to say since the data on this kind of thing is publicly available and anyone can look it up. As we move into the 1930s, things start to change quickly. The urgency felt by Jews in the Mandate intensifies as political forces jostle for control across Europe. But everything reaches a crescendo in January 1933, when Hitler is appointed Chancellor of Germany. For the record, Cooper says Hitler was elected Chancellor, but the Chancellorship was an appointed position, and Hitler was appointed by President Paul von Hindenburg, not elected by the public. The Nazis had become the largest party in Germany following the July 1932 elections when they won roughly 37% of seats in parliament. However, their support dipped slightly in the November 1932 election, dropping to about 33%, but then surged in March 1933 after the Reichstag fire decree was passed in the aftermath of what may or may not have been a false flag. The German parliament building, the Reichstag, was set on fire, and ensuing legislation was used to trample political opposition in civil liberties, paving the path for the Nazis to seize power through the Enabling Act in 1933, which basically allowed the Nazis to rule without the need to pass laws through the Reichstag and perform mass arrests of political opponents. Cooper highlights Hitler's World War I service, that he served on the front, was wounded twice, and came to believe that Germany was betrayed from within. He blamed left-wing groups like the SPD and the Spartacus League, which led strikes in January 1918 near the war's end. These events deeply shaped his view that Germany had been stabbed in the back, a belief that quickly turned into anti-Semitic conspiracy theories. Hitler tied all of this together in his mind. Marx was Jewish by birth, his ideas had inspired Lenin and Bolshevism in Hitler's eyes. And to him, Bolshevism was a Jewish ideological weapon. Never mind the fact that Marx had renounced Judaism and wrote about it with outright hostility in his 1844 essay on the Jewish question, where he accused Jews of worshipping money and equated Judaism with huckstering. Hitler calls out Marx specifically in Mein Kampf when he says, quote, Kaiser Wilhelm II was the first German emperor to hold out a conciliatory hand to the leaders of Marxism, without suspecting that scoundrels have no honor. While they still held the imperial hand in theirs, their other hand was reaching for the dagger. There is no making pacts with Jews. There can only be the hard, either or. End quote. The anti-Semitic theme of Judeo-Bolshevism became central to Nazi ideology. It wasn't just a fringe idea, it was a driving force in Nazi propaganda and policy. The invasion of the Soviet Union in 1941, known as Operation Barbarossa, was seen by Hitler as the ideological culmination of Nazism, the ultimate battle between National Socialism and its existential enemy, Jewish communism. It is true that some Jews held prominent positions in the early Soviet regime. Leon Trotsky, born Lev Bronstein, was a Jew and arguably Lenin's number 2 during the Revolution and Civil War. But it's also true that Lenin himself wasn't Jewish, and the Bolshevik success owed far more to the support of ethnic Russians, Red Army conscripts, and peasant mobilization than to any ethnic bloc. So why did the blame fall on the Jews in Germany? Part of the answer is accessibility. Germany had a domestic Jewish population, making Jews a convenient scapegoat that Hitler was able to cast as the outgroup to rally the country against. In fact, approximately 100,000 German Jews served in the German army during World War I, and about 12,000 died in combat. But for the Nazis, facts like these didn't matter. What mattered was the narrative, and by casting Germany's defeat, economic collapse, and social unrest as a result of Jewish conspiracy, the Nazis built a foundational myth, one that paved the road to the events of the 1940s. Cooper then goes on a rant about the Nazis that's worth highlighting. He says, quote, "The Nazis are often framed today as reactionary conservatives trying to recover some supposed lost age. But in the 1930s, the Nazis were considered by themselves and by most other people to be on the cutting edge of modernity. Progressive people at the time believed that science and technology had granted man vast powers over nature, and that power demanded that man be a responsible steward of nature. Eugenics is a dirty word today, thanks in part to the Nazis, but again, in the 1930s there were people all over the world, mainstream, serious, progressive people who believed that bringing human intention to bear on human evolution was the next obvious step in applied biology." End quote. Cooper continues, quote, "The Nazis and the scientists and thinkers that they followed believed that if we now have the knowledge that would allow us to rid humanity of physical and mental handicaps, inherited diseases, and other degenerate traits," that's one of their favorite words, degenerate, "progress demands that we do that." Okay, alright, Nazis, I'm with you so far, we all like vaccines, right? End quote. That last line is obviously the kicker, given everything that the world has experienced since 2020, but beyond that, his framing of the Nazis as progressive is profoundly misleading. Yes, the Nazis adopted modern technologies and invoked scientific language, but that doesn't make their ideology progressive. Eugenics, even in isolation, is ethically fraught. It rests on dividing people into categories of the fit and unfit, and once you apply those categories through a political lens like Nazism, with its racial hierarchy, nationalism, and exclusionary dogma, you end up with policies that lead directly to forced sterilization, mass murder, and genocide. It's not surprising that Nazism and eugenics went hand in hand. Eugenics gave Nazism the scientific veneer it needed to justify policies of annihilation. Cooper's attempt to reposition Nazism as somehow progressive rather than reactionary is historically incorrect. Nazism was born out of crisis, the post-World War I defeat, economic collapse, debt, and political polarization. It was a backlash movement, a violent reaction against modern pluralism, liberalism, socialism, democracy, and cosmopolitanism. It promised to restore Germany's former greatness by purging what it saw as corrupting modern influences. That's the very definition of reactionary, not progressivism. Cooper moves forward by equating Nazism with Zionism and highlighting what he thinks are commonalities between the two. He begins with the following claim, quote, "There were some strange affinities between the way Nazis and Zionists saw the world and saw themselves. The Nazis, for example, would end up adopting the same racial definition of a Jew as the Zionists, and which the State of Israel still uses today, to determine someone's right to immigrate." End quote. Let me just say it outright. This is a deeply distorted and misleading comparison. Let's break it down. In September 1935, Nazi Germany enacted the Nuremberg race laws, one of which was titled "A Law for the Protection of German Blood and German Honor." This law imposed racial restrictions on Jews, forbidding them from marrying Germans or flying the national flag. A further decree was issued in November 1935, which formally defined who counted as a Jew. The definition was as follows, quote, "A Jew is an individual who is descended from at least 3 grandparents who were racially full Jews. A Jew is also an individual who is descended from 2 full Jewish grandparents if A. He was a member of the Jewish religious community when this law was issued or joined the community later. B. He was married to a person who was a Jew. C. He is the child of a marriage with a Jew that occurred after September 15, 1935. Or D. He is the child of an extramarital relationship with a Jew and was born out of wedlock after July 31, 1936. End quote. Under these laws, the Nazis categorized individuals into full Jews and Mischling, or mixed-race individuals. A first-degree Mischling had 2 Jewish grandparents but was not a practicing Jew and was not married to one. A second-degree Mischling had only 1 Jewish grandparent. Many Mischling were allowed to remain integrated into German society. Some even served in the armed forces and held positions of public prominence. For example, Helmut Schmidt, who later became Chancellor of West Germany, had a Jewish grandfather and served as a group leader in the Hitler Youth. Bernhard Rogge, a second-degree Mischling, was a Kriegsmarine captain in the German Navy. Others, such as Erhard Milch and Helmut Wilberg, held high-ranking posts in the Luftwaffe and were issued German blood certificates due to their perceived loyalty and service. These individuals, under Nazi law, had Jewish ancestry but were not persecuted as Jews. Some were honored by the regime. Yet, under Israel's law of return, they would technically qualify for immigration and citizenship, not because Israel is copying Nazi race laws, but because of a moral imperative to offer refuge to anyone who might be targeted as a Jew. It should be noted that everything wasn't sunshine and rainbows for every Mischling, and it was very hit or miss. Unlike the examples we just covered, many did suffer discrimination because of their limited Jewish lineage. This took the form of barring some of them from the civil service, denying them access to academic institutions, and forbidding them from marrying quote-unquote Aryans. It was hit or miss, depended on who you knew, what you did, and whether you identified yourself as Jewish or not. In contrast, the law of return passed by Israel in 1950 granted any Jew the right to immigrate and receive citizenship. This was rooted in the historical trauma of the Holocaust and in response to the mass expulsion of Jews from Arab countries in 1948. Under this law, a Jew was initially defined as someone born to a Jewish mother or who converted to Judaism and did not belong to another religion. In 1970, the law was amended to include the children and grandchildren of Jews, their spouses, and anyone with at least 1 Jewish grandparent. Not to impose a racial test, but to protect people who could be targeted as Jews, much as the Nazis had done using their own racial definitions. So yes, there is a superficial overlap in the technical threshold through grandparent lineage, but the moral and political intent could not be more different. Under Nazi law, someone with a Jewish grandparent could serve honorably in the military and receive medals. They weren't always persecuted. Under Israeli law, that same person, who may never have practiced Judaism, could still qualify for Israeli citizenship today based solely on ancestry. But this isn't the affinity Cooper claims it is. The Zionists didn't look at the Nuremberg laws and say, yes, that seems right. In fact, the original 1950 definition under the law of return was more limited than the Nazi racial definition. It was only 20 years later, in 1970, that Israel expanded its scope. Not to mimic Nazi categories, but to counter them. The expansion was in large part a direct response to the way the Nazis had weaponized ancestry. It was meant to ensure that anyone who could be targeted as a Jew would always have a safe place of refuge. And importantly, someone with 1 or 2 Jewish grandparents may not even be Jewish according to Jewish religious law, which requires matrilineal descent. And lastly, it goes without saying that Zionism, unlike Nazism, didn't see Jews as parasites and the cause of the world's ills. Kind of an important distinction behind the two competing and diametrically opposed motivations here. In continuing his effort to equate Nazism with Zionism, Cooper offers the following, quote, "You probably remember me mentioning Chaim Weizmann's line from an earlier episode, a line which again could have been spoken by Hitler's propaganda minister. There are no German, British, Russian, or American Jews, only Jews who happen to be living in Germany, Britain, Russia, or America. On a deeper level, the Zionists and the Nazis agreed about some of the fundamental attributes and shortcomings of the Jewish community. The Nazis would complain incessantly that the Jews were rootless cosmopolitans, unattached drifters, they're all cleverness and greed, not a true nation, but one which lives as a parasite on the underside of true nations. According to one German racial scientist, Zionism was a laudable effort to rehabilitate the Jewish race by curing it of its parasitic tendencies." End quote. So here we have two quotes forming the foundation of Cooper's claim. First, one he attributes to Chaim Weizmann, and second, a line from an unnamed German racial scientist who we'll unmask in a moment. Let's start with the quote attributed to Weizmann. Cooper's framing here is designed to imply that Jews can never truly assimilate, that they'll never fully belong to the countries they live in, and that Jewish identity always takes precedence, implying some form of dual loyalty, but this framing collapses immediately under scrutiny. As we discussed earlier, 100,000 Jews served in the German army during World War I. Millions of Jews have fought and died for their countries of birth. One's religion or ethnicity doesn't preclude patriotism. Is a Catholic more loyal to the Vatican than to France or Poland? The implication here doesn't hold water. That's, of course, a ridiculous thing to suggest. The other problem with this is, you know how we've spoken previously about the issues Cooper has had in the past with misconstruing quotes, selectively quoting, not including context, and a bevy of other issues when it comes to reading from sources? This is another one of those moments. This quote from Weizmann doesn't exist. What Cooper's referencing is a statement Weizmann made on July 8, 1947 in Jerusalem before the United Nations Special Committee on Palestine. Let's look at what Weizmann actually said. Quote, "The nations of the world realized, particularly the British, American, French, and Italians, that a great deal of the trouble, worry, and persecution which has beset the Jews throughout their history is due to the abnormal position of the Jews in the world. What is the abnormal position of the Jews in the world? What is it characterized by? It is characterized by one thing. I think this word, from what I can see in reports, has been used here quite often. I use this word for the first time in speaking before the Royal Commission. It is the homelessness of the Jewish people. To that I must add comment. I do not mean the homelessness of individual Jews. There are groups of Jews in the world who have very comfortable homes. The American Jews, the Jews in a great many of the Western and Northwestern countries, the Jews in Sweden, Denmark, France, and also there was in Germany, but as a collectivity, as an ethnic group, they are homeless. They are and they are not. They are a people and they lack the props of a people. They are a disembodied ghost. They are, with a great many typical characteristics, many strong characteristics, which have not disappeared throughout the centuries, thousands of years of martyrdom and wandering. And at the same time, they lack the props which characterize every nation. We ask today, what are Poles? What are French? What are Swiss? When that is asked, everyone points to a country, to certain institutions, to parliamentary institutions, and the man in the street will know exactly what it is. He has a passport. If you ask what a Jew is, well, he is a man who has to offer a long explanation for his existence. And any person who has to offer an explanation as to what he is always suspect. And from suspicion, there is only one step to hatred or contempt. I am trying to put it as lightly as I can. I do not want to describe it as the tragedy which it really is. This has rendered the position of the Jews in the world abnormal, and as a very logical consequence of this abnormal position, their relation to the outside world is abnormal." End quote. So, with that context, Weitzman isn't denying the existence of British or American Jews, but he's also pointing out that as a people, Jews in 1947 lacked the institutional embodiment of nationhood that other ethnic groups took for granted. That absence, not some inherent flaw, made their position in the world precarious. That doesn't detract from pockets of Jews feeling at home in the countries they resided in, or serving those nations patriotically. But it does mean that collectively, when it comes to enshrining Jewishness in a nation-state, that piece was missing. Now, let's turn to Cooper's second quote, from the unnamed German racial scientist. That scientist is Hans Gunther, a leading Nazi eugenicist. Cooper claims Gunther said, quote, "Zionism was a laudable effort to rehabilitate the Jewish race by curing it of its parasitic tendencies," end quote. But that's not what Gunther said. In the third edition of his book, Racial Studies of Europe, published in 1929, Gunther said the following, it's on page 105 if you want to see for yourself, quote, "A dignified and clear solution to the Jewish question lies in the separation of Jews from non-Jews, as Zionism desires, in the removal of Jews from the non-Jewish peoples," end quote. So, to be clear, there's nothing in here about curing parasitic tendencies or rehabilitating the Jewish race. So Cooper's recitation of the quote isn't correct. The important piece here is that there isn't anything mentioned about rehabilitation. There was no world in which the Jews could have been rehabilitated in the eyes of the Nazis through Zionism, as Cooper implies, and that's an important distinction between Cooper's framing of this quote and what Gunther says. What Gunther is saying is that the answer to the Jewish question is in what to do with the Jews of Europe. That's something we can solve. We can send them to Mandatory Palestine because we want them out of here. That doesn't mean that once the Jews were there, they could be rehabilitated. And there's a lot of evidence from primary sources, which include German army communications, that if the Germans had made their way to Mandatory Palestine and beaten the British back in North Africa, there were plans in place to kill the Jews of the Levant just as the Nazis did to the Jews of Europe. That distinction is crucial. What Cooper suggests, that Zionism and Nazi racial ideology shared common ground, is flatly contradicted by the historical record. Gunther and the Nazis didn't support Zionism as a viable future for the Jews. They saw it as a tool for ethnic cleansing, and had the Jews gathered in Palestine, the Nazis still intended to murder them. It's also obvious, because it's undeniable, that Zionism and Nazism had entirely opposing motives. The Nazis saw Zionism as a brief convenience on the way to annihilation. It should go without saying, but in light of Cooper's framing, it bears repeating. I know we've spent a lot of time on this subject, but it's important to fully unpack what Cooper is doing here, because he doubles down again on his effort to draw a moral equivalency between Nazism and Zionism. He says, quote, "The labor Zionists had this concept of the conquest of labor, and it was a very self-conscious attempt to reform the Jewish people to purge them of the habits of life that they had picked up on over the centuries. In the urban diasporas, Jews as a group hadn't planted a seed or hoed a garden in thousands of years, and the labor Zionists were completely committed to changing that. Change that Hitler would have wholeheartedly endorsed. It got to the heart and source of his distrust for Jewish people and why he thought they were dangerous elements in his own and in other nations. I mean, don't get me wrong, his racism was so fixed in place and his hatred for the Jews was so rooted that he probably would have said that attempt was doomed to fail. Or that if it succeeded, he probably would have just made up some new excuse to hate them, don't get me wrong, but it is interesting because it shows that there's an underlying internal logic to nationalism. The Nazis and Zionists were both nationalists, and in a way they both valued many of the same things and criticized and distrusted many of the same things." End quote. Let's start with the first part of this quote. Cooper's claim that Jews hadn't planted a seed or hoed a garden in thousands of years. That line may have a kernel of truth in it. By the late 19th century, Jews in Europe were overwhelmingly urbanized, but the implication here is misleading. It suggests that Jews avoided agricultural labor out of aversion or cultural decay. In reality, the opposite is true. Jews were for centuries legally barred from owning land or working in agriculture across much of Europe. It's clear regardless, though, that this statement is clearly hyperbole. In the Pale of Settlement under Russian rule, Jews were restricted from living in rural areas and confined to towns. By the 1880s, laws were passed explicitly banning Jews from leasing or cultivating farmland. In Austria-Hungary, feudal landholding systems and guild exclusions prevented Jews from entering agriculture for generations. In Prussia, Jews weren't even allowed to buy property until the Edict of Emancipation in 1812. So while Jews may not have been planting seeds, it wasn't for lack of willingness, it was because they weren't allowed to. Cooper's framing erases that context entirely. And none of this even touches on the experience of Jews elsewhere outside of Europe, like those in the Middle East, who are on the record of engaging in agriculture, as if the problem was insufficient exposure to agrarian toil. That idea is grotesquely ahistorical. I'm not sure if Cooper is familiar with this, but above the entrance gate to Auschwitz is a sign that reads Arbeit macht frei, or work sets you free. Between 1 and 2 million Jews were subjected to forced labor by the Nazis, including in industrial plants like the IG Farben rubber factory near Auschwitz. Jews were literally worked to death. The Nazis weren't waiting to see if Jews could be redeemed through honest labor. Their racial hatred was categorical and exterminationist. Cooper's claim isn't just inaccurate, it's unbelievably sloppy. And lastly, and we've touched on this a little bit earlier in this episode, Cooper claims that Zionists and Nazis were both nationalists who valued many of the same things and criticized and distrusted many of the same things. Zionism arose as a direct response to the dangers posed by the fear of antisemitism and ideologies that embraced it, precisely the kind of racial nationalism embodied by Nazism. Zionism sought self-determination as a shield against annihilation. Nazism sought to annihilate. The two movements aren't in parallel, they're completely in conflict. So this really begs the question, why make this comparison at all? Why keep returning to it, as Cooper so frequently does? The only conclusion that I can see is that it's an attempt to smear Zionism by association, to draw a moral equivalence when none exists. Cooper then attempts to downplay Nazi agency by suggesting their ideology was merely an extension of widespread mainstream attitudes. He says, quote, "I don't say this to lighten the load of responsibility carried by the Nazis, but it's important, very important, in my opinion, from the standpoint of historical accuracy and moral honesty to understand that the Nazis were just following through on a line of thinking that was absolutely mainstream everywhere in Britain, the US, and Europe." End quote. There's a kernel of truth here, but the framing is distorted to the point that we're doing mental gymnastics just reading this passage. Yes, in the decades leading up to World War II, anti-Semitic ideas were widespread across the West. Henry Ford, for example, published The International Jew in the 1920s, a virulently anti-Semitic series that drew heavily from the fabricated Protocols of the Elders of Zion, a forgery originally propagated by the Tsarist Russian secret police. So yes, there was plenty of bigotry in the public sphere at the time, but to suggest that Nazi ideology was merely the logical continuation of that mainstream sentiment is deeply misleading. This is a rhetorical maneuver that conflates prejudice with industrial genocide. Western anti-Semitism, whether in the US, Britain, or elsewhere, was real and often ugly. But only the Nazis transformed Jew hatred into an industrial system of mass murder. The difference isn't merely one of scale, but of intent and execution. The Nazi regime didn't just inherit mainstream views. They radicalized them into something unprecedented, the mechanized extermination of a people. And while it's true that other states, like Tsarist Russia, engaged in violent persecution of Jews through pogroms and restrictive laws, no modern state before Nazi Germany created a logistical infrastructure, trains, camps, bureaucracies, chemical industries, explicitly for the purpose of physical annihilation. So to draw a line from Henry Ford to Treblinka and suggest it's all part of the same mainstream arc, it's not just an oversimplification, it's a moral flattening of history. The Nazis weren't simply products of their time, they were ideological revolutionaries who escalated hatred into something horrifying. Their actions were not the inevitable outcome of popular opinion, they were the outcome of deliberate, organized, and uniquely genocidal policy. The reduction of agency on the part of the Nazis continues with another gem from Cooper when he says, quote, "Once Hitler was in power, Jews around the world very quickly saw that something was happening. Jews around the world rallied and beseeched their governments wherever they were to act against Germany in whatever way they could. Tens of thousands of American Jews rallied in Madison Square Garden to denounce the Nazis, and Jews around the world organized a massive boycott of the German economy. And keeping in mind, this boycott stung a little bit, and it confirmed in Hitler the certainty that the Jews did in fact have it out for Germany, and they had set out to crush her as soon as someone who was onto their game had taken power. And again, Hitler's plans did not depend on a boycott from world Jewry, and I don't mean to say that anyone provoked Nazi persecution of the Jews, but the boycott gave Hitler the pretext he needed to get started with the persecutions. The first concentration camps were opened right after that in 1933." End quote. Despite Cooper's half-hearted hedge at the end there, it's clear he's assigning partial blame to Jews for giving Hitler a so-called pretext, as if Hitler wouldn't have found or manufactured one anyway. By 1933, Mein Kampf had been on bookshelves for nearly a decade, and in it, Hitler had already laid out in explicit terms his hatred for Jews and his vision of their destruction. No boycott was needed to convince him. If you take this line of thinking to its logical conclusion, if the Jews hadn't given Hitler a pretext to act on his antisemitism, then is the implication that the Jews of Europe would have remained safe? If only the Jews hadn't boycotted German industry? It's just a ridiculous conclusion to come to. Cooper also claims that the boycott stung Germany economically. That's simply incorrect. Between 1933 and 1939, Germany's economy grew by over 50%. Fueled by rearmament, massive public works like the Autobahn, and significant government spending, Nazi Germany was preparing for war. It wasn't teetering from a Jewish-led boycott. Unemployment plummeted, and industrial output surged. While some Jews and Jewish organizations did launch boycott efforts, particularly in the US, they weren't universally enforced, nor were they widespread enough to inflict serious damage. Britain maintained trade links with Germany until 1939, and the US until 1941. The boycotts were symbolic more than they were effective. So let's be clear, Hitler didn't need a pretext. He needed power, and once he got that in 1933, everything that followed was by design. As we move forward in our timeline to the mid-1930s, tension in Palestine is rising. After the violence of the 1920s, the Jewish community is increasingly on edge, coming to the sober realization that peaceful coexistence may no longer be possible. More and more people are beginning to lend credibility to the militant outlook of figures like Zev Jabotinsky. Against this backdrop, the Jews began preparing for the possibility of another outbreak of violence, because within just over a decade there had already been three: 1920, 1921, and most recently 1929, the deadliest one yet. To avoid being caught unprepared again, the Jewish community starts taking active steps to defend itself. You'll recall that in response to earlier violence, the Haganah had been formed in the early 1920s. It begins smuggling weapons into Palestine. One such shipment arrives in the port of Jaffa in 1935, but it's intercepted by British customs officials. Inside, 800 rifles and 400,000 rounds of ammunition. This discovery sends shockwaves through the Arab population. Let's look at how Cooper characterizes the moment. He says, quote, "This was something on a scale so far beyond anything they had imagined was going on, or that they had access to themselves, that they were really excited about this, to say the least. There had already been rumors from some of the more radical Arab leaders that the Zionists had been plotting to launch a preemptive attack against Arabs to drive them out of Palestine, but the British had generally been able to convince most of the others that they had things under control." End quote. It's kinda hard to see at this point in 1935 how the Jews importing arms could be perceived as anything like a preemptive attack after the events that have transpired in the region. It's clear that the Jews wanted to be prepared if another round of violence was inflicted upon them, but there's nothing preemptive about the Jews importing guns at this juncture unless you erase the past 15 years of violence in the region. Cooper then adds that the Arabs saw this as confirmation that, quote, the Zionists had been violating the British instructions this whole time and that they were arming themselves and training fighters while the Arabs had been asleep at the wheel, mindlessly obeying the British, end quote. How could anyone seriously describe the Arab population as asleep at the wheel when we've just walked through the events of the past decade and a half? Was Haj Amin al-Husseini mindlessly obeying the British when he incited the 1929 riots with inflammatory sermons and pamphlets? And how about the mob in Hebron? Were they taking British orders when they slaughtered their Jewish neighbors, most of which were anti-Zionists and living in Hebron for centuries? If you want to take issue with Jewish immigration and land purchases, I think that's a valid conversation to have. You can say that Jewish immigration was changing the character of the territory and that Arabs didn't like that. You can have that discussion. You can make that point. But don't sit here and tell me that the Jews were investing time, energy, and money into smuggling in guns and ammo in 1935 for nefarious purposes. Don't morph the order of operations, the timeline of events that got us to this point. Look, if there's a break-in on your street and someone's car gets stolen, you're probably going to think about your own home. Maybe you'll install a better lock or put in an alarm system. But if someone breaks into the house next door and they kill your neighbor's entire family, you're going to the gun store. You're probably going down there pretty quickly and you're coming home with something. That's just how our minds work. If you're confronted with danger or discomfort and it's right in your face, you're going to take steps to prepare yourself for when it shows up on your front porch. So for the Jews in Palestine at the time, that's what they were doing here. But regardless, the local Arab population interprets this as a hostile action, and one of the Arab notables who becomes a hero in the eyes of many Palestinians, Izz al-Din al-Qassam. In response to this, he puts out a call to activate cells of fighters to rise up against the British and the Zionists. On November 6th, his group killed a Jewish police sergeant, which triggered a manhunt, and later that month in November, he was surrounded with 3 of his men and killed. His name is enshrined within the military wing of the terrorist organization Hamas, which is named in his honor as the Al-Qassam Brigades. Qassam's death was one of, if not the largest, political events in Palestine to date at this point, with his funeral attracting thousands of people who were very much inspired by his acts of resistance against the British and the Zionists. As we move forward into the end of 1935, the region is once again on the cusp of violence. Cooper tells us that the British, sensing the rising tension, attempted to cool things down by proposing a legislative framework for Palestine, one that would include both Jewish and Arab representation. This next quote is a bit long, but I think it's important to understand how Cooper sets the stage for his listeners on this issue. He says, quote, "The Grand Mufti and the others relented. They accepted a power-sharing agreement with the Zionists, including all the recent new arrivals in a Palestinian representative government. They brought the message back to the people that, look, it's not perfect, but at long last, the transition to a Palestinian self-government has begun, and they prevailed upon the people to halt and condemn any violent activities, but it wasn't going to be that simple. The Zionists had always been focused on establishing a majority in the entire country of Palestine, but as late as the early 1930s, this was something that most of them were seeing happen. Maybe 100 years down the road. You know, 1 more acre, 1 more goat, right? Well, they just had doubled their population in Palestine in the last 4 years. Many of them began thinking about a majority not by the end of the century, but by the end of the decade, and so the Zionists just rejected the plan outright. If they could keep up this race of immigration just a little longer, they might have a majority soon, and then they would consider talking about a representative government. Until then, the Zionists didn't want to do anything that might legitimize any Arab claim to Palestine. Now, this annoyed the High Commissioner, Arthur Wauchope, to no end, and he pushed the proposal up to London anyway, which received it with a stamp of approval from both the High Commissioner and the Arab leaders. So this proposal arrives back in Whitehall. The Palestinian High Commissioner that they have down there in charge wants it. The Arab leadership wants it. But by the time the proposal was brought before the British Parliament in March 1936, Chaim Weizmann had, tickled enough ears and maybe greased enough palms to make sure that the measure was defeated. The Mandate authorities want it, the Arabs want it, the Zionists don't want it. Too bad. The Arabs thought by accepting this they were making huge compromises. They knew that the High Commissioner fully supported this legislative council, and so when it went down in Parliament, two things were completely confirmed as far as the Arabs were concerned. First, the Zionists owned the British government. How could a proposal go down in flames when the High Commissioner, the highest authority, the highest British authority in the country, and the whole Arab leadership representing two-thirds of the country's population were in favor of it? How was that possible? And second, it confirmed to them that the Zionists were not negotiating in good faith. They were getting a good deal here. The Arabs were compromising by agreeing to a power-sharing agreement that legitimized and accepted the gigantic number of immigrants that had arrived in the last 4 years. But the Zionists wouldn't even accept that, and so to the Arabs this seemed like proof that the Zionists were not interested in any proposal that involved sharing any power." End quote. So that was quite a bit, but I think it's important for you to understand how Cooper is framing this moment. The gist of what he's saying is that Arab political leadership agreed to a joint Palestinian legislature, where power would be shared with the Jews, that this proposal had the backing of the British High Commissioner in Palestine, who then sent it on to London, where it was debated and ultimately defeated, and that Jewish lobbying efforts, especially through Chaim Weizmann, played a pivotal role in ensuring it never made it through the House of Commons. Now, I know this isn't the first time I'm saying this, but once again, the historical record doesn't really line up with how Cooper presents it. In fact, it contradicts it in some key ways. To illustrate that, I want to read a couple of quotes from historians Cooper himself frequently cites. This first one is from Benny Morris. Quote, "After the cement barrel incident, rumors spread that the weapons were meant for a massacre or at least a war against the Arabs. A one-day general strike was called. Another took place the following month. On November 25th, the 5 Arab political parties submitted a joint protest to the High Commissioner, demanding a cessation of Jewish immigration, a stop to land transfers, and the establishment of a democratic, that is, Arab-majority, government. Britain's effort to set up a legislative council in which the British would retain the final say were rejected by the Arabs and the Zionists, and were finally shelved when MPs from both sides of the House of Commons roundly condemned them as contrary to the spirit of the mandate. Inconsequential follow-up negotiations were interrupted in April 1936 by the beginning of the general strike that marked the first stage of the revolt." End quote. So Morris is telling us here that the proposals for a quasi-parliament in Palestine were rejected by both the Arabs and the Zionists. This wasn't just one side saying no thank you. That matters because regardless of anything that may have happened in London or whatever influence Weizmann may have had in British political circles, the reality is that neither party on the ground in Palestine agreed to this proposal. Neither the Jews nor the Arabs supported the formation of a shared legislative body in the form that was being floated. So when Cooper portrays this as a missed opportunity caused solely or even primarily by Zionist interference, he's selectively retelling the story. The historical record doesn't support the idea that this was some viable moment for cooperation that was sabotaged unilaterally by one side. What it actually reflects is just how deep the mutual distrust and conflicting national visions already were by the mid-1930s. Morris isn't the only historian who says this. Tom Segev also takes a similar line here when he says, quote, "Eventually Wauchope admitted that he had been mistaken in his approach to governing Palestine. When he had arrived, he had hoped to meld Jews and Arabs into a single civil society. To that end, he had tried to institute an idea that had been circulating in Palestine since Herbert Samuel's term, a Jewish-Arab legislative council, but this did not work out. No one wanted a council." End quote. So again, no one wanted a council. This wasn't something either the Jews or the Arabs signed on to. It never had the support of either camp. Which makes this whole lengthy narrative from Cooper about how Husseini and the Arab leadership approved it, and then how the proposal made its way to London before being sabotaged by Weizmann, just fundamentally untrue. It didn't happen, and that's according to 2 historians Cooper regularly cites throughout this series. We're once again confronted with another example of something that could be easily clarified by looking at the sources Cooper claims to rely on. But instead, we get a version of events that aligns with a particular narrative, one that doesn't hold up when you check the record. The reason why this is important is because Cooper goes on to frame the breakout of violence in 1936, which we'll be getting to in just a second. He frames this as the result of this proposed legislature being rejected solely by the Zionists. He tells us, quote, "With this latest failed attempt at compromise by the Arab leadership, sporadic violence resumes around the country led by those disaffected young men who are not connected to the big families or to anything else. They're just pissed off." End quote. This framing squarely places what's coming on the Jews, when in reality no one agreed to a parliament in Mandatory Palestine at this time. So we're on the cusp of the breakout of violence once again, and do you remember in previous episodes how we've covered Cooper framing the Zionists as an invading army? How he frames them as radicals on par with the Marxists or the Bolsheviks? Remember the last episode when he described what happened in 1929? When civilians were butchered, how he framed that as war. Well, we reach another inflection point, the crescendo of this symphony, when he says the following, quote, "When an army occupies a territory, making way for other people to move in, dispossesses the population, and is trying to impose a new governmental regime that the people there don't want, that's not immigration, that's an invasion. It doesn't matter if the people moving in are using someone else's army to do it, it's an invasion, and it's always been an invasion." End quote. This is a pretty revealing statement. Despite Cooper having previously feigned sympathy for the Zionists, offering a modicum of understanding for why they fled persecution, the actual act of them doing so, in his eyes, is an invasion. They're an army, they're revolutionaries, they're all fair game, they're all combatants. The men, the women, the children. This is exactly the same line of thinking that we've seen used to justify recent events in modern Israel in the aftermath of October 7th. If everyone is a combatant because everyone is a settler, then no one is an illegitimate target. Everyone is fair game. There are no civilians. That's the end state of this line of thinking, and there's a direct line from Cooper's twisted framing here to how people speak about this conflict today when they justify what can only be described as acts of terrorism. And so with this in mind, on April 15th, 1936, a group of Arabs set up a roadblock in the hills around Tulkarm. They shot 3 Jewish drivers, 1 died on the spot, another died from their wounds 5 days later, and a third one survived. In an act of revenge a couple days later, members of the Irgun drove up to a shack and shot dead 2 Arabs. On April 17th, at the funerals for the 2 dead Jews, the crowd in attendance takes its anger out on an Arab passerby and a policeman who came to his defense. 2 days later, an Arab mob rampaged through Jaffa and killed 9 Jews and injured almost 60, during which a British police officer killed 2 rioters. This prompted thousands of Jews to flee Jaffa to nearby Tel Aviv, and in the ensuing days, 8 more Jews were killed by Arab mobs and 6 Arabs were killed by the police. The disturbances spread and evolved into what would become the largest uprising against the British in the Middle East. On April 25th, the Arab political leadership led by Husseini formed the Arab Higher Committee, or AHC, replacing the Palestine Arab Executive. The AHC called for a general strike across Palestine, a total halt to Jewish immigration, and a ban on land sales to Jews. They issued an ultimatum. If their demands weren't met by May 15th, they would escalate to active resistance and armed violence. In May, the British tried to appease the AHC when they announced an offer to limit Jewish immigration. 4,500 Jews would be allowed in over the next 6 months. But the AHC wasn't interested in compromise. They wanted a complete halt, and when they didn't get it, they extended the strike and shifted to urban terrorism and armed rebellion in the countryside. Benny Morris tells us that in May alone, 41 bombs exploded in Jaffa and 35 more in Haifa. On May 16th, an Arab gunman opened fire on a Jewish crowd leaving a movie theater and killed 3 people. In response, the British blew up parts of Jaffa's old city and destroyed 220 homes, and the few Jewish families still in Hebron, which had returned since the pogrom of 1929, were evacuated. At this point, Cooper downplays the involvement of the AHC and the backroom deals happening to support the revolt as the violence spreads. Cooper says, quote, "The Arab Higher Committee reached out to the High Commissioner again to try to negotiate an end of the strike, and with the help of the surrounding Arab countries and some of their ambassadors, some of who had contacts with the gangs fighting in the hills, and so with the help of Watcho was able to convince the Arabs to end the strike, while the British government would send a commission to investigate the crisis and figure out how to mediate the dispute." End quote. So the framing here is that the AHC were the good guys trying to keep the violence in check once it had broken out. Let's hear how Morris, who we referred to earlier, characterizes the AHC's role in all of this. Quote, "From the start, the AHC denied any connection with the rural rebellion or the urban terrorism, but it is clear that it and its subordinate national committees had a hand in setting up the rural bands, and financing and supplying them, as well as in organizing at least some of their urban terrorism. Amin al-Husseini's aides later maintained that he secretly led the revolt during the first 2 months." End quote. He continues, quote, "As usual, it appears he was playing a double game, in the words of a British observer. In August, however, the SMC came out explicitly in favor of the revolt. The Husseini newspaper, Al-Liwa, encouraged the rebels to fight until God had pronounced his sentence." End quote. So, were the AHC and Husseini really trying to keep a lid on all of this, as Cooper suggests? Doesn't really seem like it. Seems more like they were trying to play both sides by telling the British they were trying to calm things down while simultaneously hedging their bets, not knowing if they'd need the help of the British in the future. And there's more. Morris points to a crucial dynamic that Cooper leaves out entirely, the role of foreign intervention in bolstering the revolt. Morris writes, quote, "The bands and the AHC at this time probably also got funds from Italy, which, at loggerheads with Britain over Abyssinia, wished to disrupt the British rear. In June 1936, British Foreign Secretary Anthony Eden wrote that the disturbances have been fomented to some extent by Italian money and intrigue. In September 1940, the Italian Foreign Minister Count Galeazzo Ciano spoke of millions dispensed to the Mufti. Haganah intelligence picked up indications that Germany too was transferring funds and arms to the rebels. German and Italian propaganda campaigns supported the rebellion and lambasted the mandate." End quote. So the Germans and Italians, under Mussolini and Hitler, saw this as an opportunity to strike at Britain's soft underbelly in the Middle East, just as the British had done to the Ottomans a generation earlier. The Axis powers were now using Palestine to undermine their enemy, and yet none of this is acknowledged in Cooper's telling of events. The violence and strike drag on until September-October of 1936, at which point the British have shipped in reinforcements and become very aggressive with putting down the violence. They're blowing up the houses of people they find participating in all of this, and it's clear that the rural bands supported by the AHC aren't going to be able to keep this thing going against the British Army. At the same time, the British decide to send a commission to examine the causes of the disturbances. The AHC sends out a letter to its militia bands and says the following to them to encourage a halt to the violence, quote, "Honored brethren, heroes, our poor tongues cannot express the strength of our love and admiration at the exaltation concealed in our hearts for your self-sacrifice and your devoted war for religion, fatherland, and all things Arab. Rest assured that your struggle is engraved in letters of flame in the chronicles of the nation, and now we urge you to stop activity until needed. Save the bullets and take care of them. We stand now in a period of hope and expectation. If the Royal Commission comes and judges equitably and gives us all our rights, well and good. If not, the field of battle lies before us. We request self-control and armistice until a new notice." End quote. So the British send over a commission of officials in November 1936 led by Sir William Peel, or Lord Peel, and it's made up of 5 members who began surveying the situation on the ground. Cooper quotes heavily from Tom Segev here, and there's this whole paragraph from Segev about how the main leaders of the Jewish and Arab communities met with the commission and took these closed-door sessions with them very seriously. Cooper reads through this entire paragraph, but notably, he leaves the last sentence out. He goes through all of this and highlights how Ben-Gurion told the commission that the Jews had a connection to the land through history and the Bible, and how he was careful not to use the word state, but referred to the Jewish desire for a national home. But this next sentence, Cooper leaves this out. Segev writes, quote, "The Mufti said that there was no chance for coexistence in one country between 2 such different nations, and that any attempt to force coexistence was liable to harm both parties." End quote. Now, in isolation, I honestly don't think that this is really that inflammatory a remark, but when you take everything that we know about Husseini up until this point, from the 1920s to now, including accepting foreign aid from Nazi Germany to support the rebellion in 1936, it's pretty clear that he and the AHC are maximalist, and that there was never going to be any compromise here. So when you infuse all of that context into this statement, I think that sentence matters a whole lot. Seeing that both sides have hardened their stances given over a decade of violence in the region, the Peel Commission releases its report in July 1937, and it states that the conflict was impossible to solve through the creation of a single state, and that the mandate was unworkable, and it instead proposed a partition of the territory with the Jews receiving a fifth of the region and the Arabs receiving the rest, aside from Jerusalem and Bethlehem, which were to stay under British control. The Arab territory was also to be combined with Transjordan. The Commission also came to the conclusion that for this partition plan to work, there would have to be a population transfer of 225,000 Arabs to the Arab territory and 1,250 Jews to the Jewish territory, with compensation paid to those moving. Here's how Cooper characterized the reaction of Jewish leadership to the Peel partition plan. Quote, Weitzman and Ben-Gurion, they were begging the Zionists to take this on. The Jewish agency, who now is being influenced by an increasingly assertive and militant Zionist Organization of America, refused to accept the plan, but they did agree to consider future proposals if maybe the pot were sweetened. End quote. Here's what actually happened. We return to Morris again. Quote, Partition and transfer were debated at length during the 20th Zionist Congress, which met in Zurich in August 1937. A large minority insisted on the indivisibility of the land of Israel and opposed the Peel recommendations, but the bulk of the delegates accepted the principles of partition and transfer. Many shared an urgent sense that a haven must be created to which the Jews of Europe could emigrate, untrammeled by quota or restrictions. The final vote was 299 to 160 in qualified favor of the Peel package. End quote. That qualified favor is key. The Congress didn't accept the Peel plan as proposed. It rejected the specific borders, restrictions, and limits on immigration and land acquisition. But it did accept partition as a possible basis for negotiation and authorized the Jewish agency to explore the idea further with the British. Zionist leadership was under enormous pressure from unfolding events in Europe and saw this as a potential path toward a sovereign refuge for Jews, but Cooper misrepresents this moment. He portrays the Zionists as having flatly rejected compromise, when in reality they rejected the details of the Peel plan, not the principle of partition itself, which was rejected by Husseini and the AHC. It didn't matter anyway, because the British government distanced itself from the Peel Commission's recommendations, as they didn't think partition was a good idea despite the Zionists accepting this. Which, by the way, goes to show you that there wasn't some dark cloud Weitzman was hanging over British Parliament controlling them from the shadows. They exercised independence despite what the Zionists wanted out of them. In July of 1937, the AHC rejected the Peel report and stood firmly against the idea of partition, and in September, the rebellion resumed. On October 1st, the British declared the AHC illegal, and Grand Mufti Haj Amin al-Husseini fled by boat to Lebanon, and from here on out, the rebellion proceeded without centralized leadership. In 1937, the rebels launched 438 attacks, 143 of which were against Jewish settlements. The fighting continued into 1938 and dragged on until August 1939. The Nashashibis, the more moderate Palestinian political faction and the primary opposition to the Husseinis, had withdrawn from the Arab Higher Committee prior to its banning, and they severed ties to the revolt as a result. What followed was a kind of mini-civil war, as Husseini supporters carried out bombings and assassinations against the Nashashibis in a violent internal power struggle. Ultimately, the Husseinis emerged with dominance over Palestinian political life. It's within the context of this revolt that we see a further, more militant shift among the Jews in Palestine as well. Morris tells us, quote, Until mid-1937, the Jews had almost completely adhered to the policy of restraint. But the upsurge in Arab terrorism in October 1937 triggered a wave of Irgun bombings against Arab crowds and buses, introducing a new dimension into the conflict. Before, Arabs, and less frequently and usually in retaliation, Jews, had sniped at cars and pedestrians and occasionally lobbed a grenade, often killing or injuring a few bystanders or passengers. Now, for the first time, massive bombs were placed in crowded Arab centers, and dozens of people were indiscriminately murdered and maimed, for the first time more or less matching the numbers of Jews murdered in the Arab pogroms and rioting of 1929 and 1936. End quote. So you start to see the cycle really take shape here. The revenge attacks, the blood feud, the retaliations. Obviously, there was already a history of violence in the region, but it's around this point that Jews in Palestine begin reacting in a similar fashion to attacks on civilians. A critique that Cooper brings up, and he's not alone in bringing this up, is that in the context of the revolt and the Peel proposal, some members of Jewish leadership saw the partition plan as a beachhead, a strategic starting point for eventual expansion. Not every Zionist leader felt this way. Some sincerely supported a two-state compromise, but it's true that others saw Peel as a strategic opportunity to gain a foothold. Cooper uses this to argue bad faith on the part of the Zionists, and yes, Husseini and the AHC felt that this was a real possibility too. These concerns aren't totally baseless, but here's the thing. If Jewish leadership had accepted the plan, which they did, in principle, and then tried to expand later, they would have been in a politically impossible position. I mean, game this out with me. What justification could they have given for launching an expansionist policy after agreeing to partition if the Arabs had agreed to peace? Ben-Gurion wouldn't have had a leg to stand on. And if he had tried, the Arab territory would have been joined with Transjordan, a state whose sovereignty was guaranteed by the British. It was essentially a British protectorate under Abdullah. Any aggression against it would have triggered an international condemnation and intervention. That's what I think is important to clarify here. It's one thing to adopt aggressive policies in theory in the face of repeated violence. It's another to agree to an international settlement and then violate it. The Zionists originally desired the entire mandate before Palestine was split off from Transjordan, and the mainstream leadership accepted a reality in which that wasn't the case. They then accepted a scaled-down version in the Peel Commission by agreeing to the principle of partition. There's a record of shrinking expectations. What I'm trying to say here is that there was a real window in 1937 where the two-state solution everyone talks about today could have become a reality in the 20th century. If the principle of partition, which had been birthed in the Peel Plan, had been accepted by both sides, there's a real chance that a Palestinian and Israeli state could have been founded and coexisted side by side, despite the tumultuous situation in the mandate. But it simply wasn't meant to be. Aside from the revolt winding down at the end of the 1930s, there are several other key developments worth highlighting. The first is Hitler launching his expansionist playbook. In March 1938, Nazi Germany annexed Austria in what became known as the Anschluss. Just a few months later, in September, Britain and France struck a deal with Hitler, what we now call the Munich Agreement, permitting Germany to annex the Sudetenland, a region of Czechoslovakia that bordered Germany and had a majority ethnic German population. Neville Chamberlain, the British Prime Minister at the time, had negotiated the deal and famously believed it would secure peace for our time. The assumption was that Hitler's appetite would be sated after Austria and the Sudetenland. But, of course, that was wrong, and there's a lesson in there somewhere about the effectiveness of appeasement in the face of ideologically driven dictators. Germany invaded the rest of Czechoslovakia in March of 1939 and demonstrated that sometimes people lie and just take what they want even after they sign pieces of paper. Crazy, I know. Now, while all of this is happening, Jabotinsky, the leader of the Beitar movement and the revisionist Zionists, is in Poland, where he's been since 1936. He's sounding the alarm, warning the mainstream left-of-center Zionists that they don't understand what's happening on the continent and that the situation for Europe's Jews is deteriorating rapidly. He came up with a plan to evacuate over 1 million Jews from Europe to Palestine, but no one took him seriously. Around the same time in 1938, the United States convened the Evian Conference in France. The goal was to bring together representatives from countries around the world to address the growing refugee crisis caused by Nazi persecution of Jews. The hope was that some nations might agree to take in Jewish refugees, giving them a chance to escape what was unfolding in Europe. But the conference was a total failure. Not a single country except the Dominican Republic expressed a willingness to take in Jews. It was a devastating moment, and in hindsight, it's one that sealed the fate of millions of people. The direct line between the failure at Evian and the Wannsee Conference, where the Nazis formalized the industrialized annihilation of the Jews, is clear. The Nazis, of course, bear primary responsibility for their actions and have agency themselves. But there are, of course, some deeply uncomfortable moral questions that arise here. Questions that go beyond the scope of this episode. Questions like, do the Allies, despite eventually liberating Europe, bear some measure of moral culpability for having slammed the doors shut on Jewish immigration before the war? And if so, how does that culpability compare to that of the Nazis, who created the need for mass emigration in the first place? I'll let you reflect on those questions yourself. As we shift into 1939, the British are reaching the end of their rope. They see what's coming in Europe. Austria and Czechoslovakia have already been engulfed by Hitler, and it's clear that war is on the horizon. The last thing the British want while bracing for global conflict is the Middle East unraveling in their rear, the World War II equivalent of a Hashemite rebellion. Cooper quotes Neville Chamberlain as saying, quote, "We are now compelled to consider the Palestine situation primarily from the standpoint of the international situation. If we must offend one side, let us offend the Jews rather than the Arabs." End quote. The thinking behind this was blunt, but from the British standpoint in 1939, pragmatic. War is coming. Forget the Balfour Declaration. Britain's looking at a region with 35 million Arabs with vital oil wells in Iraq and Iran, and with growing unrest that could explode at the worst possible time. If Chamberlain had to pick a side, he was going to prioritize the Empire's strategic position over past commitments to the Jews. Cold calculus, but from a wartime perspective, understandable. So in May 1939, the British issued a new white paper following the failed London conference earlier that year, where Jewish and Arab delegations once again couldn't reach an agreement. With time running out before Europe erupted into war, Britain took matters into its own hands, offering what it saw as a final plan to stabilize Palestine. To the Zionists, the white paper felt like a betrayal, an absolute reversal of the Peel Commission's trajectory. Just 2 years earlier, partition and a Jewish state had been on the table. Now, in 1939, that promise was revoked. Instead, the white paper capped Jewish immigration at 15,000 per year for 5 years, after which no further immigration would be allowed without Arab consent. It declared that the entire mandate would become a single independent state governed by Arab-Jewish proportional representation, meaning an Arab majority. It also imposed severe restrictions on Jewish land purchases, confining them to designated zones. For Jewish leaders, this wasn't just a diplomatic defeat, it was existential. Jews had immigrated to Palestine to escape the centuries-long reality of being a persecuted minority. They saw this document and remembered the pogroms of 1929, 1921, and 1920. They saw Cossacks with sabers in the streets of Russia running them down. David Ben-Gurion called the white paper, quote, "the greatest betrayal perpetrated by the government of a civilized people in our generation," end quote. So you would think, given how beneficial this deal was for the Arabs, and given how visceral the reaction from the Zionists was, that Haj Amin al-Husseini and the Arab Higher Committee, who were in exile at the time, would have leapt at the opportunity. This was the best offer the British had ever put on the table. They had Palestine in the palm of their hands, from the river to the sea. And what does Husseini do from Beirut? He fumbles. He rejects the white paper. And why does he do so? Because he was, for the 1,000th time, a maximalist. Even 75,000 more Jews was too many. And anything less than total and immediate control and a total halt to Jewish immigration was, for him, completely unacceptable. So he said no. And with that refusal, with that hand wave, history was made. There would be no second chance to seize that opportunity, because 3 months later, the world was changed forever. Episode 5 of Fear and Loathing in the New Jerusalem ends at the dawn of the Second World War. On September 1st, 1939, Hitler invaded Poland, and the millions of Jews living across Eastern Europe were now falling under the control of a regime so ideologically twisted that even the Einsatzgruppen death squads would be soon considered insufficient for its aims. Jabotinsky had been waving his arms and screaming for years that this was coming. And then it came. The volcano, as he once called it, had erupted. The lava was goose-stepping across borders, burning through them on the map as though they had never truly existed. We have one more episode to cover in this miniseries, at which point we'll be exploring bold claims made by other influencers moving forward. We'll continue our critique of Fear and Loathing in the New Jerusalem next time, and we'll keep holding those making extraordinary claims accountable to the historical record. That brings us to the end of this episode of Crackpot History. If you enjoyed listening to it, feel free to share it with someone you think would get something out of it as well. Thanks for tuning in. See you next time.